Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, land values and the economy. Do we factor in the influence of land value enough in economics, given that it's not just the amount of land that counts, it's also the position of the land? And just how wrong would things go if it was left entirely to market forces? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Now, land is considered as part of capital when we look at the factors of production, Steve, but it's a limited resource, isn't it? We can't have any more land, and even though there's a lot of it, it's the distance that counts, the distance from markets or distance from the power grid, and in that sense, it is heavily constrained, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is the point which was the major contribution I think that Ricardo actually made. I certainly don't regard comparative advantage as a contribution. I see it as a step backwards. But in terms of valuing land, he had a very simple model that said that when you first settle or you first start producing food, you use the best available land. So he has a qualitative grade in the quality of the land for producing output. He said you use the highest quality land initially, and then as you expand production, you've got to use lower quality land, which therefore means the higher quality land has a higher value in terms of capacity to produce than the lower quality land. You can't charge rent. Of course, rent is charged, but his hypothetical model was you couldn't charge rent on the lower quality land, but you could charge rent on the higher quality land because there was a premium. It produced more output, and therefore that was the source of money going to the landlord. The owner of the land would gain the increase in value between the lower quality stuff now being used as population grows and the higher quality stuff was the initial.
But surely you could charge rent on all of it. You could just charge a higher rent on the high yield.
This is one of the points that Schumpeter made in his critique of Ricardo, where he talked about the Ricardian vice of making simplifying assumptions that eliminated everything else, and therefore led the only conclusion you could reach was the one that the assumptions led you to. But fundamentally, yes, he said that the source of rent is the differential quality of the land, and that now, when you look in the scale of why is land so expensive to rent, why houses so expensive to buy in the heart of London versus in the periphery, it's because you're closer to the market. And that is the value. And that's where and I must confess I have never read Henry George. Yes, I know a lot of people will be annoyed by that. Some of you are quite pleased by it. I simply haven't had time to get around to reading Henry George. But that was, I think, the fundamental point that Henry George was making, which pretty much Ricardo's theory of rent, and saying that increase in the value that people get by being landlords who own land in the heart of London is not due to what they're adding, it's due to the location and the social improvements that are made around that area. Yeah, and they gain from it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess they're always going to go up, aren't they? Because it's a constrained resource, we've got a growing population. I mean, it's no surprise that land values, because land is going to increasingly be in demand, the value of land is going to continually increase, isn't it?
And that's where people argue for a land value tax, to say, well, that increase is occurring not because you are adding to the value of not because you've added to the value of the land, but because let's just say
you were just lucky enough to have been able to afford it in the first place. Yeah. And from there on in, it's only going to go up. So you're just benefiting from history, basically.
Yeah, and like the classic thing which is happening in the UK right now, in London right now, is that they're calling the Elizabeth line, aren't they?
Yeah.
The new line. Okay, that Elizabeth line, wherever those stations pop up, areas which used to be relatively remote from transport in the heart of London are now going to be much, much closer to transport in the heart of London. Their prices will rise, and the idea of a land value tax is to say, well, that's not because you did anything to the land, because the state built that facility, which has now increased the accessibility of your patch of land to the rest of the city, and therefore we should be able to tax that. And in fact, a lot of people argue you could in fact pay for a lot of the infrastructure by putting a tax on the properties nearby whose values rise because of the state or whatever, even a commercial enterprise building that line beneath you. That should be taken back to the people who actually add the value, which is not the landlord, it's the society adding the facilities around it, which the landlord benefits from.
Well, so that then gets into the position of the land, which we sort of said, yes, well, obviously the distance from everything else is important, and that includes the distance from facilities. So, building something new is an example, particularly if you're building, if you've built something and then something else comes along, then should you pay for the increased value? Similarly, if you build somewhere and then someone builds an airport right next door to you, should you be compensated? And it starts to get complicated because you can look at that in every for almost everything. There will be something that changes, which will change the value of the land, and it's external to the landowner.
But it also becomes an issue of what about communities themselves? Because I support, I get people often. Let's go back, just backtrack slightly. A lot of people, the George's philosophy ends up with people saying we should have a land tax and that should replace everything. And effectively what they're saying is...
Including, what you say, no income tax, just land tax, right.
And that to me is, first of all, making a mistake about the function of taxation. It's still, from the perspective of seeing taxation of financing the spending the government does, which is a gold bug model of what money is. Money is gold, and you tax and get some of the gold for the state, and the state can then spend the gold. When the state creates fiat money, it doesn't need that. It doesn't need to tax it to get the money to spend in the first place. It's taking out of money the massive amount that it's injecting in by being something of the order of 30 to 50% of GDP, as the state is now across the whole Western world, including the United States, when you include in all the various levels of the government. And if you had that much extra money being created every year, you'd have a blowout in the money supply, a blowout inflation, et cetera, et cetera. So tax recirculates it. That's its real functional role. So the focus upon land tax as a way of raising revenue for the state is wrong. But a focus on land tax as a way of clawing back an increase in value that individuals get from work done by the network of which they are part. But they are not the ones doing the work itself. That does make sense.
And I can see a lot of good reasons why there should be more tax on land. And we'll talk about that in the full version of this podcast, which you can't hear, but you can if you subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. Choose one of the subscription plans on the right-hand side of the website, or you become a supporter of Steve on Patreon. If you pledge $10 or more per month to support Steve's work, then you get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. So we hope to see you back here again for the full version of this podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. See you soon.